Aha! Yes! Eureka!
Somewhere between the coast of Turkey and the coast of Greece is a body of water called the Icarian Sea. And it's named after this guy Icarus, who is the central character in a very famous myth. And the myth goes something like this. There was this guy named Daedalus, and he was a great inventor. And he built this extravagant labyrinth for King Minos, who promptly imprisoned him inside this labyrinth, doomed for the rest of his life. Just to make things worse, he decided to also bring along Daedalus' son Icarus. And this was all in good, except for the fact that King Minos didn't realize that Daedalus was this exuberant genius who promptly decided that they were going to get out of there by crafting a set of wings out of feathers and wax. And he gave his son a set, and he himself took a set. And before they were launching off, Daedalus turned to Icarus and he said, "Look, just take the straightest path possible. Don't you fly too high, because if you do, you'll get too close to the sun, it'll melt the wax on your wings, and you'll fall to the ocean to your death." And so Icarus said, "No problem, Dad, I got this. This is a piece of cake, I got this." And he leaps out of the labyrinth and soars, only to realize that flying was the greatest thing he had ever experienced. And he becomes drunk in this state and starts to soar higher and higher and higher. And you guessed it, he gets too close to the sun. The wax melts off of his wings, and he falls to his death in is what now known as the Icarian Sea. And it's a funny story because I really don't understand what it's trying to tell us. What's the lesson here? Don't disobey the king. Listen to what your dad says. Don't really try and imagine that you're better than you are. Fall into that box that society puts you in. And certainly don't dream big because you're up to fail. Now, I think that's dead wrong. I think that's totally wrong. We have a grade 9 trade show. And in that trade show, there's a lot of parallels to Icarus. Students are tasked with creating a business plan of a new invention or idea that can generate money. And I think what's lost on some of the students is that they think that their invention is what's going to be judged, and it's not. They're going to be judged on their business plans. They're going to be judged on how much money an investor can make off of them. And while it's true that the invention is certainly tied into this, it's not the only thing it's tied into, because not all good inventions make money. And we fail to recognize this in our teaching to these students in particular, because we're in a world of capitalism, and capitalism helps enable culture, but the issue is we often forget that Einstein and Rembrandt and Beethoven, they didn't have business plans for their ideas. They just made work and art for the sake of doing it, without any idea of how much money it was going to return based on how much time they were going to put in. And with that disconnect, I think you're finding a lot of people who may be leaving a lot of creativity on the table. And that's what the Icarus Deception talk is about today. I want to say up front that this talk is inspired by Seth Godin. He was the one who came up with the title Icarus Deception, and so I'm really playing off of it. But I'm also going to extend it into the world of education, because I think this idea of flying high is something that we hope for in our students, but we certainly perhaps don't enable it to the best of our ability. The best thing that you can do, and what I call the 80-20 rule, or the 80%, is to show up. So if you're going to start a new business, if you're going to join a club, if you're going to do something interesting that may be hard and may have a risk of failing, that you may fly a little closer to the sun, I would suggest to you that 80% of the job is just showing up, just doing it. 80% of you listening to this talk right now. 80% of the work is just being present. And that's important because it's the last 20% that arguably are the hardest, because that's where the work happens. But you can't ignore the fact that you're not going to do any work unless you get started, unless you show up, unless you're present. And maybe some people are just comfortable with that. We see students all the time who just come to class, just do enough to get by. And perhaps they're just in the 80% mindset. I just need to get by. And so once you understand that showing up is 80% of the work, then you can focus in on that 20. Because showing up is pretty black and white. You're either there or you're not. You're either starting to write your book or you're not. You're either studying for the test or you're not. Once you know that, then you can start to dial in that last 20%. And that's why you're listening today. You want to focus in on that last 20%. So let's get back to Icarus. What is it that Icarus did that really caused him to fail? He saw something interesting and exciting and flying, and it was different, and he flew too close to the sun. Now, is the opposite that you just do what your father says? Perhaps it's true. Perhaps it's true. Had Icarus just listened to his father, he clearly would have survived. But here's the thing. Because I'm a teacher, I get to see this all the time. I don't think we're teaching the students to fail properly. And I want you to take note of the word properly. Is there a proper way to fail? I mean, you fail a test, you fail an activity, you fail to make a sports team. It seems pretty clear-cut to me. The goal here is for you to understand why you fail at what you do. And if you're failing because you're flying too close to the sun, then that failure is actually good. That's the failure we're after. We're not looking at the kids, the 80% who are comfortable with the 80%. I'm thinking of the kids who are striving for that extra 20%, who are reaching out, who are taking a chance, taking a risk, and they fail. And that's the kind of failure we want. We want kids to aim high. We want them to take a chance. We want them to reach beyond their limits just to see what it feels like. And if they fail, we want them to know it's okay. We don't want to make it better for them, but we want them to understand that they took a chance to reach for the stars and they missed, and that was okay. That they just weren't mediocre, that they weren't aiming too low and failed, that they were aiming too high and failed. And that is a good thing. And it's important to remember, if we could bring Icarus back from his mythological death and ask him, would he fly high again? He might say yes. I would think he'd probably say yes 1,000 times over, because he was experiencing something new and exciting, and he wanted to reach as far as he could, as possibly could. I doubt that he was just doing it to disobey. And that's where the confusion lies, especially in education. Here's a good example. This is Johann von Gutenberg, and he's the first guy to invent the printing press. In his book, Ideas, by a guy named Peter Watson, he lists out the top ideas that humans have ever come up with. And the printing press is number 3. Now, I want you to take a minute and think about that. Out of all of the amazing inventions that the humanity has come up with, the internet, space travel, cell phones, he marks the printing press as number 3. Right behind fire and self-actualization. Actually, I think I got that wrong. I think it's number 1 is self-actualization, and number 2 is fire, and 3 is the printing press. So understanding who we are and that we're individual thinkers is a very important idea that humanity has discovered. Otherwise, we would just be this collective set of ants in a ant's nest working away to some queen or leader. Understanding that we can control our destiny is obviously the first step to come up with any idea, let alone the top ideas. And of course, fire. Fire is what really changed the physiology behind who we are. But interestingly is the printing press. And what's cool about the printing press is that von Gutenberg actually invented this before most of Europe could read. The only people who could read are generally religious backgrounds who were trained in Latin. And so here's this tool to mass produce text to somebody and a bunch of people who can't read. Why on earth would you do that? Does that not mean, does that not recognize as instant failure? I mean, think about that today. Try and invent something. Try and invent a space flight training program, for example, to people who have no idea how to fly a spaceship, let alone have the means to do so. This is the kind of scale that we're talking about, because if you can't read, what on earth are you going to do with a book, and why would you want to do with it? But he went and did it anyways, not because he was into making money, but because he saw what the future could bring. Imagine a Europe, imagine a world where everybody could read the Bible themselves. Everybody could read history. It would enable people to become obviously more intellectual, but reinforce that self-actualization, that they can take in knowledge and do something with it. And that's what von Gutenberg saw. And so he did. He went ahead and he made the printing press, and the rest is history. The same goes with Carl Benz. Carl Benz was the guy who invented the first car. Now, it was a silly-looking tricycle machine, probably didn't go very fast. But the key that Benz did, like von Gutenberg did, is he invented the car before there were any roads. The only available means of a car traveling at that time were down horse paths, which were lined with horse stool and rough, because obviously horse hooves aren't like tires on a car. But Carl Benz, again, saw the value in a self-propelled transportation that doesn't require horses, that requires some sort of other power. And he went ahead and he invented it anyways. And again, the rest is history. So we have to understand that when we push the envelopes of creativity, when we push the envelopes of innovation, risk and failure are huge. And in a capitalistic society, we have every opportunity to go out and make amazing discoveries. But yet, a lot of people are just comfortable with that 80%. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. You can make an excellent living and live a wonderful life by just getting by. And many people do. But there are people out there, some of them, including yourselves, who want to go for that 20%, who want to aim high, who want to fly close to the sun. And we have to take careful watch as to who those people are. And we either have to empower them, or if you're in the business world, you need to follow them and understand them. And thirdly, you need to be them. You need to reach out. You need to invent the printing press before anyone can read. You need to invent the car before there's any roads. So the next step here is to discuss, well, why don't people do it? Why don't people aim higher? This is a loon. A loon is a bird in lakes all across Canada. There's several in what we would call cottage country in the GTA. But the interesting thing about loons is that there's only one loon per lake, or a pair of loons, because loons are the type of animal who mate for life. So there's only one set of loons per lake. And if another loon comes along and calls, the loons will call back. And as Seth Godin has mentioned, if you take a stereo and you put loon sounds out onto the lake, the loon will call back. But if you keep doing it and you play it louder, the loons will get scared because they think another bigger, more powerful loon is out there watching them. And so they'll fly away. They don't aim high. And I want you to think of that in the context of this guy. This is Jonathan Petrie, and recently he passed away of a very awful disease where your skin randomly blisters. It's a genetic condition that didn't really have a cure. However, lots of progress was made as a result of him publicly coming forward and showing the life that he has to live as a result of this condition. And I was absolutely inspired by him because Jonathan couldn't even take a bath without being in pain. He felt physical pain every single day of his life. Every single day. And that's something that we totally take for granted. And yet this guy had the ability to not only endure that, but get up in front of people and say, look, I can live my life really well with what I've got. I can do it. Why aren't you? As a science teacher, I obviously have to look at failure through a scientific lens. And before we get into the nitty-gritty details of the scientific literature, I just want to say that we are first and foremost emotional creatures. And for us to be successful, we have to recognize that. I mean, several motivational speakers like Tony Robbins have made entire careers off of recognizing that we're emotional and playing off of that. Because there is nothing stronger than somebody out there who's emotionally empowered by what they do. Because even if they fail, they're recognized that they're in a state of mind that's productive and progressive. And it's all powered by emotions. And I'm going to use that idea as I go through some of the theoretical concepts of why we get scared and we don't aim high. The first being our reptilian brain. So our reptilian brain is that part of the brain stem that we share with basically any animal with a vertebrae and a centralized nervous system. And ingrained in that is this idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And fight, flight, or freeze is a condition that all animals experience. And you yourself have probably experienced it as well. In any time that you feel nervous, from walking alone in the dark to standing up in public speaking to going on that first date with someone who you're really interested in. You may have experienced all three of those things at once or in a short time span, or you may have experienced one only for a long period of time. Many times people get up in front of to speak in public and they freeze because their mind goes blank, we say, or they forget the words. And that's a completely physiological reaction to a stress response, we say. So anytime you encounter danger, your body automatically defaults to this. All other systems in your body shut down. Digestion shuts down. All the complex motor processes in your brain start to shut down. Your body is smart enough and your brain is smart enough to say, hey, this is a dangerous problem and I'm not going to survive the situation until I act or I hide or I fight back. The problem with it, of course, is that in the modern world, we really don't face any of the dangers that we did while we evolved to use this mechanism effectively. We don't need to worry about saber-toothed tigers sneaking up on us as we walk at nighttime. We don't need to worry about other people invading our territory to take our resources. And we certainly don't need to worry so much about where our next meal is going to come from. So really the stress in our life is changed, but our body hasn't changed. Our body still hasn't been able to adapt. And it'll take millions of years for that to occur, and possibly it will. I'm certainly hopeful that it will. But the reality is we still rely on this reptilian brain. And it's one of the interesting things that I often talk to people about who don't recognize the importance of this simple feature. And simply recognizing it, like we talked about earlier in the 80% situation, simply understanding that you are going to experience these emotions allows your neocortex, the frontal lobe, to really kick in and give you that angel on your shoulder and say, everything is going to be fine. You are not about to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. You're not about to be destroyed. Your tribe isn't about to be overwhelmed, and you're certainly not going to starve to death. And that act alone can save a lot of stress in your life. And we'll get to that in a second. The next experience that you'll have if you get through the fight, flight, or freeze aspect is this idea that your emotions will take over. Now, I just finished saying that we're emotional creatures. Well, it's no better reason to show it than literally looking at the anatomy of the brain, where the emotional section is actually sitting on top of that ancient reptilian brain that we share with all animals. And so if you get through the fight, fight, or freeze, your emotions then take over. So you've sensed something, it's dangerous. Are you scared about it? Are you angry? Are you euphoric? What is happening? And your emotions decide the next step. So generally in a stressful situation like a saber-toothed tiger, you get scared. That triggers the frontal lobe. Now your frontal lobe decides, okay, what are we going to do about it? So if your first instinct was to run, you're running now. Your emotions start to kick in, you're scared. Now your frontal lobe takes over and says, okay, we're running away from this saber-toothed tiger. Can we outrun it? What should we possibly do? And it's at this point that your human brain is really working full tilt. This is the really important part of the process because now you're accessing all the capacities of what humans have and all of the advantages that we have over other animals in terms of our thought capacity. Whereas maybe a reptile might just keep running straight. You might decide, hey, that running, I'm never going to outrun this saber-toothed tiger. I got to turn around and fight. Or I've got to call for help. Or I've got to climb a tree. Or I've got to go in a cave. You make smarter decisions in this state. The problem that we have in it is that by this point of the decision-making process, we're often long gone. If we're on stage doing a public talk and we freeze and we forget the lines, then we get scared about it. At this point, it's difficult to recover. Even if your brain comes forward and says, look, you just froze, why don't you take a minute, think about the words, try and regroup. At this point, you've either walked off stage, you're too far gone to recover. And so we often don't recognize this. The first and most obvious zone is the comfort zone. This is a place where you feel the most calm, the most peaceful. This is you sitting on your couch watching Netflix. This is you reading a book. This is you taking a quiet walk somewhere. This is you just resting peacefully. It also may be you at a pub with your friends, or at a restaurant with your friends, or just hanging out. But there's very little learning. And you might say, well, I'm having a conversation with my friends and I'm learning something. This is true. But it's not you're not learning as a result of challenging yourself or stretching yourself. You're learning more academically. The comfort zone is easy. It's the things that you can do easily, right? And we look at this in education and say, well, if this kid is learning a skill and it's too easy for them, they're not challenged enough. And parents come in interviews and said, you need to challenge my son or daughter more because they're finding the course load too easy. And so if you can recognize this area, and you specifically have to start with your easy comfort zone because you won't really understand where you're going to stretch and where you can wander into these other zones unless you really know where your comfort zone is. Because for some people, their home life isn't their comfort zone. For some people, they go home and it's stressful. They have kids, they're busy, they're moving places, but it's just not relaxing. And that's not a result of any poor relationships or something like that, and it could be too, but most generally it's just that you don't get the chance to relax until late at night or when you get some time alone or something. And so you really have to identify those spots in your life that are easy and kind of look from there out, right? You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And so the next one is called the discomfort zone. And this is the grayest of the zones because this is the place where we like to say it's interesting, it's challenging, and it's scary. This is the zone where you want to live. This is the place where you want to be able to wander in and out of without worry that you're going to fail, or if you do fail, that it's disastrous. Because this is where the learning happens. It's not perfectly easy, it's not perfectly comfortable, but it's not so hard that you are literally fighting for your life and or so uncomfortable in the situation that you immediately want to get out of that, which is what we call the alarm zone. So we're going to skip over the discomfort zone for now and talk a little bit about the alarm zone. So this is where we call the terrifying zone. It's difficult, it's overwhelming. This would be from a physiological perspective. This is where your cortisol levels spike, your adrenaline levels spike. This would be your saber-toothed tiger attacking you. Now, some people would basically look at things like skydiving as completely in the alarm zone. And this is true. This is true. I know personally I would. And what people who do these extreme sports like skydiving or cliff jumping or climbing, surfing, what they really do is that they work to make this a discomfort zone instead of an alarm zone. Because if you've never skydived before and you grabbed a parachute and you just jumped out of an airplane, like you're in full-on alarm mode. You're full-on just being controlled by your reptilian brain. But if you kind of focus it as a discomfort and kind of peel it back, you take some training. That may be practice good techniques on the ground. You may learn the ins and outs of how a parachute works. You may practice holding the parachute, folding the parachute, spending as much time as possible in your comfort zone, learning about the process of what you're about to do, so that when it comes time to jump out of the airplane, you're not immediately leaping over comfort into alarm. You're moving into discomfort, and you can say, okay, I'm at the edge of the plane, I'm jumping out, but I know my parachute's going to work because I saw the person fold it, I've practiced, I've read, I understand everything that's about to happen. I am still really scared, really, really scared, but I know in the back of my head that it's probably going to be all right. And by probably, I mean I'm not a 50-50 chance that I'm going to die here, right? There's a good chance that I'm going to land safely, and that's really important to know. And if you want to go back to our public speaking example, the people who are absolutely terrified, who have this classic reptilian response to public speaking, don't spend enough time in the comfort zone preparing themselves. And so when it comes to public speaking, and I personally do this, I try to, as much as I possibly can, prepare what I'm going to say and be ready for anything. I imagine all of the scenarios, and this is the other thing that we haven't talked about yet, is in the comfort zone. In order to kind of get yourself ready for the discomfort zone, you have to visualize what's going to happen. And so half the battle is, yeah, I could memorize a speech, but I really need to visualize myself doing it. And I not just need to visualize it going well, I need to visualize it going bad so that I can understand when it happens that I can change it. So if I visualize in my head, hey, I'm getting up in front of somebody and I'm speaking and it's not going well, I don't remember, the audience I can see isn't engaged, how am I going to change in that moment? How am I going to be prepared to make adjustments? Because what happens is, as soon as people, even if they are prepared and they don't visualize well, they get into that moment where in public speaking you see that the audience isn't engaged, they automatically leap over right into the alarm zone. Uh-oh, something's wrong, something's bad, I'm now overwhelmed, I'm terrified, how am I going to fix this, what can I possibly do about it? And so that's the secret balance between understanding fear and growth. It's to be able to wander into the discomfort zone, to be as prepared as possible. And then to come back to the comfort zone after it's all happened and really have, as the Army says, a washout. Really sit and analyze how it went. Because that is an underrated skill, an underrated task. If you go skydiving and then you land and you don't debrief yourself, you risk assuming a lot of things. You risk assuming that it's going to work every time and that you're going to take your foot off the gas when it comes to preparation and safety. You are going to assume that if anything bad happens, you have the experience now to be prepared. And it's true that some of these things would actually happen, but the reality is that the more you're able to prepare for it, and the more you're able to debrief about it, the better you're going to be. It's almost like coming full circle. So for example, if I'm giving a speech or a chapel talk in front of people, when I come back, the first thing I do is I start to write things down. I type them out, or I record my voice. How did it go? What would I do differently? How could I change it to make it better? And the reason I do it immediately is because it's fresh in my mind. And I don't need to write a novel. I don't need to talk for 20 minutes about it. I just need to list 4 or 5 things that immediately pop into my head, good or bad, about the experience. Hopefully they're all good. And then if there are some negative things, and usually there are, if you really take a hard look at yourself, you can then deconstruct what that means. So I recently gave a chapel talk. I thought it went okay, not as good as other ones I've done. And part of the reason when I came back to debrief was the time. It went way too long. I recognized that as I saw the audience. They were getting agitated, not angry agitated, but they were, they wanted to move. They had sat long enough. And it was reinforced when I was told officially that it was too long and that I can't do them that long. And I completely understand, and that makes perfect sense, but that feedback has now allowed me to reevaluate how I'm going to approach it. And it's made me a better speaker as a result of it. And so the process of understanding the fear-comfort connection is your ability to really evaluate what's happening when you are about to go into the discomfort zone and when you come back from the discomfort zone. Because when you're uncomfortable, the last thing you want to do is evaluate what's going on. If you do, it's likely going to be in a negative context, all right? It's probably going to be, okay, I better get out of here, because you're going to creep towards the alarm zone once you start to think too much about it. So you need to take some time and imagine what it might be like in a discomfort zone. But before you do that, you really got to understand what it is that you're trying to do, that you're scared of, that's going to allow for growth. And don't be fooled by the fact that doing anything scary is going to make you a better person, because it's certainly not. I can think of many things. Trying to cross the road without using a street light is scary, but if I do safely make it across the other side, I don't feel like I've grown as a person. But perhaps talking and interacting with someone who you dislike, but you need to, so a boss, a family member, a colleague, can be frightening. It can be uncomfortable. But preparing, making that discomfort, wandering into that discomfort zone, having the conversation, and then coming back and thinking how it went will make you way more aware of how to approach it again if you need to, and how to improve the situation. So normally, I would have you do a discomfort activity. You're probably listening here, and you probably don't have time, but when you do get time, a simple activity that you can do is list down a bunch of things that absolutely frighten the population as a whole. Skydiving being one, public speaking being another. You can do physical activities, you can do mental activities, interacting with someone you don't like, and you just list as many as you possibly can. And you can get help for this. You don't need to do this independently. You can ask a loved one to say, like, let's just list things that generally frighten people. Spiders. And then what you do is you write them down, and if you can, cut them out. Physically cut them out, and physically make a circle on the ground. Doesn't have to be big, and put these fears into what you would consider comfortable, discomfortable, or absolutely alarm zone. So I know people who are afraid of spiders would definitely automatically go to the alarm zone. And from there, then you can take the ones that are relevant to you. So, I mean, if you're absolutely terrified of spiders, do you really need to overcome that fear? Is that something that's relevant in your life? Do you really need to spend the time, effort, and money to overcome your fear of spiders? Because for the most part, people can simply avoid spiders. And spiders will look to avoid you too. You choose the relevant ones, and then you think how you could make it so that it's not just comfortable, because you don't want it to be comfortable. You want to be comfortable around spiders and them walking all over your face, because it's unlikely that'll ever happen. But instead, you probably want to be able to move it to the discomfort zone, where you look at a spider and go, hey, I don't like you here, but you know what? I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to have a reptilian response to you. I'm not going to stamp you out because, spiders are really good for the environment. And so you need to figure that out. And sometimes that's, having a long look in the mirror, especially when it comes to things like interacting with people, social things, how you're going to behave in public, how you're going to maybe ask someone out on a date. Those are things that you really got to evaluate by looking in the mirror. And you can say, okay, well, I am absolutely terrified to ask somebody out on a date. And you can say, realistically, that most people are. And if you're comfortable doing that, then you can consider yourself either lucky or really strange. Because usually you're having a natural response, a lizard response when you encounter someone who you are attracted to. And so how to manage that becomes a challenge. And so you just start to think of the things that you know are going to make you succeed in that discomfort zone. You're going to say, I'm never going to get comfortable asking someone out. I'm never going to get comfortable speaking in public. But if I can just learn to live a little bit uncomfortable with it rather than full-on alarm, then I'm going to be a better person. So I challenge you to do that. I really do. And one of my favorite movies of all time is the Batman series. It's not a movie, but it's a series. And I love the Joker, the Dark Knight, because the Joker is this, in my opinion, an anti-hero. He's clearly a villain, but he also borders at the... He also borders the anti-hero because, he is closer to Batman than Batman is to humanity, right? Batman's a symbol, the Joker's a symbol. They both are trying to stand for something. Joker is standing for chaos, and Batman is standing for justice. And so they're actually more similar than they appear. And Joker's one line is just absolutely brilliant. A man with nothing to fear is a man with nothing to love. That the biggest thing that you have to remember when you face fears is that means you're alive. That means that you have something at stake. Because the moment you are indifferent, then you've lost your humanity. And I say that genuinely. And I see it on the faces of students all the time, is this nonchalant attitude towards something they're doing. And it can masquerade as boring, but it's really bold for me to say you've lost your humanity, because we underestimate how much fear can play into the growth that we face. When you're engaged in something, you're generally engaged in something new. You're engaged in something that has a fear attached to it. When you're learning to ride your bike without the training wheels, you understand what the value is to ride your bike with two wheels. You go further, faster, it's easier. But there is a fear attached. What if I fall? What if I wipe out? What if I can't do it? And having that fear tells you inherently, right in your soul, that you're doing something that you love. And the Joker was absolutely right about it. One of my favorite stories to tell is my friend Luke, who I think has represented this idea of understanding fear, not conquering fear, but living with fear to the fullest of its ability. Luke is a quadriplegic who was in a bicycle accident, a mountain bike accident in British Columbia, and broke his vertebrae, which resulted in him spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And he's been like that, goodness, almost for, I want to say it happened in 2003, so like, you're talking like 15 years. And he exclusively talks about it openly, which is wonderful, because one of the things that he admits right away was that he was absolutely in the alarm zone, not just because of the physical trauma that he faced, but because he now understood that if he were to survive this, he was bound to live a life in a wheelchair, and that absolutely terrified him. And he spent the next little while absolutely bummed out about it, and he admits it. And what's really fascinating is that his life today, despite the physical injuries, is more rich, more valuable, more helpful to humanity than it ever would have been had he landed the jump that inevitably disabled him. He owns a charity that provides free ramps for businesses. He's a speaker about his situation. And he hopes to inspire people to understand the challenges that people with accessibility issues face. And that is remarkable. That is remarkable. That story alone is something that you can turn to in a moment of darkness and understand that the human spirit is far more powerful than any person can imagine. Because even Luke, who was living it, didn't realize that he was changing not just who he was, but he was changing everyone around him, who they were. And that's what's amazing about being a human being, is that when you change for the better, inevitably everyone around you changes for the better. There's also a similar story of Kyle Menard, who was born without arms or legs, and he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and he's a motivational speaker as well, along the same principles. It's just remarkable that these people who face these amazingly overwhelming odds are so often the most inspirational people. And I think it has to do with the fact that once you realize that you're vulnerable, once you realize that regardless of what you do, you're never going to overcome general human suffering. And instead, if you can put that away, you can tuck that away somewhere, and you face your fears, and you face your challenges, and you invite them in, that's the best reward ever. So there's not days where Luke goes, oh man, I'm really glad that I got disabled. But instead, he keeps that tucked away, and he understands that he has to live with that. And he puts it somewhere where it doesn't have to bug him. And that he uses that instance, that as a motivation to go forward. Well, I'm in this chair as a result of an accident. What am I going to do about it now? Because when bad things happen to you, it's easy to just crawl into a cave and say, woe is me. But the most powerful people say, great, now what am I going to do about it? And the next time you face failure, you have to understand that it's not just a learning opportunity, which is just jargon for it's okay, get back up and face it again. Understand that fear and failure are connected. Understand that success doesn't mean an absence of fear or an absence of failure. That success is really the ability to live with fear and failure. And the more you're able to live with more fear and more failure, the more successful you're going to be. It's in Yoda, in the picture here with Yoda talking about to Luke when Luke couldn't lift the spaceship out of the swamp. He gives up and he says, I can't do it. And Yoda looks him dead in the eye and says, this is why you fail. You take your failure and your fear and you make it command you. You think that it's either success or failure when absolutely it's not. You can't have one without the other. They need to live together. It's not a zero-sum game. And living with fear and failure, using it, is going to make you an absolutely better person. I promise. So I'm going to end here, and I want you to understand the power of aiming high, that Icarus aimed high, despite the fact that he could fail. And when he did fail, if given the chance, if he was still alive, he would do it again.